Somebody take him away. The command cut clean through the soft hum of jazz and crystal clinking, sharp enough to turn heads without raising a voice. Conversation stalled mid-sentence. A server froze beside a silver tray of champagne flutes. Near the center of the grand ballroom, under a chandelier that scattered warm light like broken gold across polished marble floors, a young boy stood trembling, his small hands pressed tightly over his ears as if the world itself had grown too loud to bear. Ethan Whitmore's breath came in uneven bursts, his chest rising and falling too fast, too shallow, his eyes darting through a sea of unfamiliar faces that blurred into something overwhelming and unreachable. His father, Richard Whitmore, stood a few feet away in a perfectly tailored black suit, his jaw set, his posture rigid, his voice low but edged with impatience as he gestured toward the nearest staff member. Now, he added, quieter, colder, as if urgency alone could solve what he didn't understand. The music continued, but softer now, hesitant, like even the band sensed something had shifted. Across the room, Ava Johnson stood near the service entrance, her fingers lightly curled around a folded linen napkin, her uniform crisp but modest, blending her into the background the way she had learned to be present, useful, unseen. But her eyes weren't on the guests or the trays or the instructions whispered through earpieces. They were fixed on the boy. The way his shoulders tightened with every burst of laughter from nearby tables. The way his knees bent slightly, as if bracing against a wave no one else could feel. The way his silence was louder than everything else in the room. Ava took a slow breath, the scent of polished wood and expensive perfume barely registering as something older, deeper stirred in her chest, a memory not of sight, but of sound, of nights filled with restless pacing, of quiet voices spoken gently into storms no one else could see. Around Ethan, 2 security staff approached cautiously, exchanging uncertain glances as they closed the distance, their polished shoes echoing softly against the marble floor. One reached out, hesitant, as if unsure whether to guide or to grab. Ethan flinched at the movement, his hands pressing harder against his ears, his entire body shrinking inward. A faint murmur rippled through the guests, subtle but present, curiosity wrapped in discomfort. Richard's gaze flicked briefly across the room, calculating, aware of the attention, the optics, the disruption. "Handle it," he said under his breath, his tone firm, controlled, final. Ava's grip on the napkin loosened. For a moment, she didn't move. Not because she didn't know what to do, but because stepping forward meant stepping out of the invisible line that kept her safe. The line that said stay in your place. The line that said people like you don't interrupt moments like this. But Ethan's breathing hitched again, sharper this time, and something inside her answered before fear could. She stepped away from the wall, her shoes silent against the floor, moving not fast, not slow, but with a quiet certainty that didn't ask permission. A few heads turned. A guest raised an eyebrow. Someone whispered. Ava didn't look at them. She kept her eyes on the boy as the distance closed, as the light shifted across his face, as the noise pressed in from every direction. And just before the security guard's hand could reach him, she spoke, her voice soft, steady, cutting through the tension without force. "Wait." Ava did not raise her voice again, and she did not step closer than necessary, but something in the way she stood shifted the air between them, quiet but firm, like a line drawn without words, and for a brief second even the security guard paused mid-motion, his hand hovering uncertainly as he glanced toward Richard for instruction, waiting, always waiting, because in rooms like this every action followed power, not instinct. Yet Ava was not looking at the guard or at Richard or at the dozens of eyes now subtly turning toward her. She was looking only at Ethan, at the tremor in his fingers, at the way his breath caught in uneven rhythm, at the invisible storm building behind his eyes, and she lowered herself slowly, deliberately, until she was no longer standing above him but kneeling a few feet away on the polished floor, her movements careful, controlled, making no sudden shifts that might startle him further, her hands open and visible, resting loosely against her knees as if to say without speaking that she was not here to take, not here to force, only here to be present, and the distance between them remained, untouched, respected, a small space carved out in a room that did not understand space at all. "Hey," she said softly, her voice barely louder than the faint hum of the band restarting in the background. Tentative notes drifting through the tension. "You are okay. the word simple, unadorned, not meant for anyone else to hear, and Ethan did not respond, not at first, his shoulders still tight, his hand still pressed against his ears, but something in his gaze flickered, just for a second, a break in the panic as his eyes landed on her, not fully, not steadily, but enough, and Ava stayed exactly where she was, not moving closer, not reaching out, letting the moment stretch, letting him choose whether to close the distance or keep it, because she knew that choice mattered more than anything she could say. Behind her she could feel the weight of attention building, the subtle shift of discomfort turning into judgment, whispers threading through the edges of the room, and then Richard's voice came again, low and controlled but sharper now. "What do you think you are doing?" he said, each word measured, deliberate, carrying the quiet authority of someone unused to being interrupted. Ava did not turn her head, did not break eye contact with Ethan. "He is overwhelmed," she answered gently, not defensive, not challenging, simply stating what was already true, but the simplicity of it seemed to harden something in Richard, his posture tightening as he stepped forward, closing the space between authority and defiance. "That is not your concern," he replied, his tone cool, clipped, the kind of voice that dismissed without needing to raise itself. "Step away," the words landed. Heavier this time, enough to make one of the nearby guests shift uncomfortably, enough to pull the attention of the entire room into a single silent line drawn between them, and still Ava did not move, not because she was ignoring him, but because Ethan's breathing had changed, just slightly, just enough that she noticed, the sharp edges softening into something less frantic, less immediate, and she spoke again, softer this time, almost a whisper. "You do not have to look at anyone else," she said to the boy, "just stay right here," her voice steady, grounding, and Ethan's fingers loosened, just a fraction, enough for one ear to slip free, enough for the noise of the room to creep back in, but no longer crash over him all at once, and that was when Richard stepped closer, his shadow falling across both of them, his presence firm, undeniable. "I said step away," he repeated, and this time there was no patience left in it, only expectation, only command, and slowly, carefully, Ava lifted her gaze from Ethan to meet his father's eyes for the first time, calm, unflinching, not confrontational but not retreating either, and in that quiet collision of authority and empathy, the room held its breath, waiting to see which one would break first. Richard Whitmore did not raise his voice, but the space around him tightened, the kind of silence that followed power when it expected to be obeyed without question, and for a moment the entire room seemed to lean in that direction, waiting for Ava to step back, to lower her gaze, to disappear into the background where she was supposed to belong, but she did not move, not yet, because Ethan's breathing, fragile and uneven just seconds ago, had found a rhythm that was still shaky but no longer breaking apart, and she knew from experience that one wrong interruption could pull him straight back into the storm. "Sir," she said quietly, her tone respectful but steady, "he is starting to calm down," and the words were not a challenge, not a refusal, just an observation offered with care, but Richard's expression hardened slightly, not with anger, but with something colder, something more controlled, the kind of resistance that came from a man who was used to being the one who understood every situation before anyone else did. "That is not your decision to make," he replied, his eyes sharp, fixed on her with a measured intensity, and behind him a few guests shifted, their curiosity now fully awake, their attention no longer subtle, drawn to the quiet standoff unfolding in the center of what was supposed to be an elegant evening. A woman near the bar leaned closer to her companion and whispered something behind her glass, while a man in a navy suit adjusted his cufflinks as if pretending not to watch, but watching all the same, and the musicians, uncertain, softened their tempo again, the notes stretching thinner, quieter. Like a soundtrack unsure of where the scene was heading, Ava felt the weight of it all pressing in from every direction, the expectations, the judgment, the invisible boundaries that had always been there even when no one spoke them out loud, and for a brief second her fingers tightened slightly against her knees, not out of fear, but out of memory of other rooms, other moments where stepping forward had come with consequences, where doing the right thing did not always mean being allowed to stay. But Ethan shifted then, a small movement, almost imperceptible, his shoulders dropping just a fraction as one of his hands lowered completely from his ear, his gaze no longer darting wildly but settling, slowly, uncertainly, back on her, and that was enough for Ava to stay exactly where she was, grounded, present, refusing to rush what could not be rushed. "You are doing okay," she murmured, her voice soft but clear enough for him to hear, and Ethan's breathing followed her words. not perfectly, not immediately, but gradually, like someone learning how to stand again after losing balance, and Richard saw it, even if he did not fully understand it. He saw the difference, the subtle shift in his son's body, the way the tension eased by degrees instead of breaking all at once, and for the first time since the moment began, his expression flickered, not with doubt exactly, but with something close to it, something unfamiliar, something he did not control. "Ethan," he said. Stepping slightly closer, his voice lower now, less commanding, more cautious, as if testing a tone he was not used to using, but the moment his shadow moved across the boy again, Ethan's breath caught, not fully collapsing, but tightening, pulling inward as if bracing for something unseen, and Ava noticed immediately, her eyes never leaving him. "Give him a second," she said gently, still not looking away, and that was when the shift happened, subtle but undeniable, not in Ethan, not yet, but in the space between authority and understanding, where Richard stood, caught between instinct and observation, between control and something he had never learned how to practice, and for the first time that night, he did not speak right away. The silence stretched, not empty but charged, like the moment before a storm decides whether to break or pass, and Richard Whitmore remained standing there, his shoulders squared, his presence still commanding the room even as something unseen began to shift beneath that control, because for all the power he carried, for all the rooms he had walked into and taken over without resistance, this was different. This was not a negotiation or a deal or a system that bent to logic and pressure. This was his son, and his son was not responding to authority, not tonight, not in this moment, and Ava Johnson, still kneeling on the polished floor, did not rush to fill the silence. She did not explain, did not justify, she simply stayed where she was, grounded in a stillness that felt almost out of place in a room built on movement and status, her eyes steady on Ethan as his breathing continued to soften, uneven but no longer breaking apart, his fingers now resting loosely at his sides instead of clamped against his ears, and the smallest shift happened then, so small that most of the room would have missed it, but not Ava, not Richard. Ethan leaned forward just slightly, his gaze no longer scattered but focused, searching her face with a fragile kind of trust that had not been there before, and Ava responded not with movement but with presence, her voice low and calm. "That is it, you are doing just fine," she said, each word measured, not filling the air but anchoring it, and behind her someone let out a quiet breath they had been holding too long, while a server slowly lowered a tray that had remained suspended mid-service, unsure until now whether the moment would explode or dissolve. Richard watched closely, his eyes narrowing not in suspicion but in concentration, as if trying to understand a language he had never needed to learn before, and for a second he glanced at the security staff still standing nearby, their posture uncertain, waiting for a command that did not come, and he lifted his hand slightly, a subtle motion, but enough to signal them to step back, not fully, not completely, but enough to give space where before there had been pressure, and the shift rippled outward, the invisible tension easing just a fraction as the room adjusted to his silence instead of his command. Ava noticed but did not react to it, because Ethan's attention had changed again, his small hand lifting slowly, hesitantly, as if testing the air, not reaching fully, not committing, but moving closer to the space between them, and Ava did not meet it halfway. She did not close the distance, she simply let her hand rest where it was. Open, patient, allowing him to choose, because choice was the difference between control and trust, and for a long second that stretched into something deeper, Ethan hovered there, his fingers trembling slightly, before lowering them again, not retreating, just not ready yet, and that was enough, more than enough, because the storm had not returned, it had quieted, and Richard saw it clearly now, the difference between force and understanding, between solving and listening, and something in his posture softened, not visibly to most, but enough that the sharp edge of command faded from his expression, replaced by something quieter, something uncertain, something human, and when he finally spoke again, his voice was lower, stripped of its earlier certainty. "What are you doing?" he asked, not as a demand this time, but as a question, and Ava, still steady, still calm, answered without looking away from Ethan. "I am giving him space to come back," she said, and the word settled into the room like something simple and undeniable, something that did not belong to power or status or control, but to understanding, and for the first time that night, Richard did not interrupt. The words lingered in the air, simple yet unfamiliar, and Richard Whitmore did not respond immediately, not because he did not hear them, but because he did not know where to place them, not in the framework he had built his life on, not in the systems that always rewarded control and decisiveness, and for a moment he simply stood there, watching, observing something unfold that he could not command into existence, while Ava Johnson remained still, her presence quiet but unwavering, her attention anchored entirely on Ethan, who now sat on the edge of that fragile calm, his breathing slower, his shoulders no longer drawn tight, his eyes fixed on her with a cautious curiosity that had replaced the earlier panic, and the room, though still filled with people, had shifted into a kind of suspended distance, as if the center of gravity had moved away from wealth and status and into something far more human, something that could not be measured in numbers or influence, and then, without warning, the balance broke, not violently, not loudly, but sharply enough to pull everything back into tension, as one of the guests, a man standing near the edge of the circle, leaned toward another and spoke just loud enough to carry. "This is inappropriate," he muttered, his tone edged with discomfort disguised as propriety, and the word inappropriate moved through the air like a ripple, subtle but powerful, reinforcing the invisible lines that had been crossed, and Richard's expression tightened again, the flicker of uncertainty replaced by something more familiar, something firmer, the instinct to restore order, to re-establish control before the moment slipped too far beyond his grasp, and he straightened slightly, his shoulders aligning with the version of himself that the world expected to see, decisive, unyielding, and his gaze returned to Ava, sharper now, more defined. "That will be enough," he said, his voice carrying just enough volume to reach beyond the immediate circle, enough to signal that the moment was ending whether it was ready to or not, and the subtle shift in the room followed instantly, the guests easing back into their roles, the staff straightening, the music finding its rhythm again, because authority had spoken and the structure had reasserted itself, and Ava felt it, the weight of that expectation pressing against her, the unspoken command not just to step back, but to disappear again, to restore the illusion that nothing unusual had happened. But Ethan's hand moved then, quicker this time, reaching forward with a sudden urgency that had not been there before, his fingers brushing lightly against the edge of Ava's sleeve, not a full grasp, not a firm hold, but enough to stop the moment from closing, enough to interrupt the return to normal, and Ava's breath caught for just a fraction of a second, not from surprise, but from recognition, because she understood what that small gesture meant, how much it cost him to reach out at all, and she did not pull away, did not react sharply, she simply allowed her hand to turn slightly, her fingers open, offering stability without taking control, and Ethan's grip, though still light, settled there, grounding him in a way nothing else in the room could, and Richard saw it, the contact, the connection, the undeniable shift in his son's behavior, and for a second the command he had just given seemed to hang unfinished in the air, challenged not by defiance, but by something far more difficult to dismiss, and the room noticed too, the subtle hesitation, the break in the expected flow, and the same guest who had spoken earlier fell silent, his judgment suspended by the visible truth unfolding in front of him, and Richard's jaw tightened, not in anger, but in conflict, caught between the pressure of perception and the reality of what he was witnessing, his son, who had resisted every attempt at control, now reaching willingly toward someone who had offered none, and the tension settled there, unresolved, stretching the moment into something that could no longer be easily undone. The contact remained, light but unmistakable, Ethan's fingers resting against the fabric of Ava's sleeve as if that single point of connection was the only steady thing in a room that still felt too large, too loud, too much, and Ava did not shift, did not tighten her hand or draw him closer, she simply stayed exactly where she was, allowing the moment to exist without pressure, without expectation, her breathing slow, even, something he could follow if he chose to, and gradually, almost imperceptibly, Ethan's shoulders lowered another inch, the tension leaving his body in small, careful increments, like someone stepping out of cold water one breath at a time, while the music in the background softened again, not stopping, but fading into something distant, no longer the center of attention, and the conversations that had begun to restart earlier now quieted once more, not out of obligation this time, but out of something closer to awareness, because what was happening in front of them no longer felt like a disruption, it felt like something they were not meant to interrupt, and Richard Whitmore stood just a few feet away, his posture no longer rigid in the same way, his arms no longer crossed, his hands hanging at his sides with a stillness that did not belong to control, but to hesitation, and he watched his son carefully, not with the urgency of fixing, but with the unfamiliar weight of observing without interfering, his gaze moving from Ethan's face to the small hand resting against Ava's sleeve, then back again, as if trying to understand the connection that had formed without his permission, and the longer he stood there, the more the contrast sharpened. Every command he had given, every attempt to manage the moment, had only tightened Ethan further. Yet this quiet presence, this refusal to rush, had done what authority could not, and the realization did not arrive all at once. It settled slowly, pressing into the edges of his certainty, reshaping something he had always believed was enough, and Ava felt his gaze shift, felt the question behind it, but she did not look up, not yet, because Ethan's attention had deepened, his grip, though still gentle, now steadier, his breathing aligned more closely with hers, and after a few seconds that stretched into something calm, she spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "You can let your hands rest now," she said, not instructing, not correcting, just offering, and Ethan responded, slowly lowering his other hand. Completely, both arms now relaxed at his sides except for the one still touching her sleeve, and the change, though small, was undeniable, and Richard saw it clearly, the absence of panic, the return of control that had not been forced but allowed, and something in his expression shifted again, not sharply, but enough that the edge of resistance softened into something closer to acceptance, and when he finally moved, it was not forward, not into the space to take over, but slightly to the side, stepping out of the direct line between Ava and Ethan, creating space where before there had only been presence, and no one in the room missed it, the subtle repositioning of a man who was used to standing at the center now choosing, even if only slightly, to step back, and the effect was immediate. The tension that had lingered at the edges of the moment eased further, as if the room itself exhaled in response, and Ava noticed, not as a victory, not as a shift in power, but as an opening, a quiet permission for the moment to continue without interruption, and she remained still, steady, present, her focus unwavering, because she understood that what mattered now was not what had already changed, but what still needed time, and in that stillness, with the light reflecting softly off the marble floor and the distant music barely reaching them, the room that had once felt overwhelming began to feel, if only for a moment, like a place where something fragile could finally settle. For a moment nothing moved except the quiet rhythm of Ethan's breathing, steady now, anchored, his small fingers still resting against Ava's sleeve as if letting go might undo everything that had just been rebuilt, and Ava remained exactly where she was, grounded in that stillness, her presence calm, unhurried, her eyes soft but attentive, giving him the space to exist without pressure, without expectation. And it was in that quiet that the shift became undeniable, not just in the boy, but in the room, because what had started as tension, as disruption, had transformed into something else entirely, something that demanded attention not through force but through truth, and Richard Whitmore saw it clearly now, the difference he could no longer explain away. His son, who moments ago had been unreachable, now sitting in a fragile but real calm, connected not to authority, not to control, but to someone who had offered neither, and the realization settled deeper this time, not brushing against his certainty but moving through it, reshaping it in ways he had not prepared for, and slowly, almost cautiously, he took a step forward again. Not into the space to reclaim it, but closer to understand it, his voice quieter than before, stripped of its earlier sharpness. "Ethan," he said, but this time there was no command in it, only a question, a presence that was learning, and Ethan's head turned slightly, not fully, not immediately, but enough to acknowledge the sound, enough to show that he heard him without retreating, and that alone was something Richard had not seen in a long time, and he paused there, just outside the space Ava had created, careful now in a way that did not come naturally to him, watching for any sign that his presence might disrupt what had been built, and Ava noticed the change, not in his words, but in the absence of force behind them, and for the first time she lifted her gaze fully to meet his, not in defiance, not in challenge, but in quiet understanding, a recognition of the shift that had taken place, and she gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, not permission, not instruction, just an acknowledgement that the moment could hold both of them if handled with care, and Richard responded without realizing it, his posture easing further, his shoulders lowering just slightly as he adjusted to this new balance, and then Ethan moved again, more clearly this time, his hand loosening its hold on Ava's sleeve, not pulling away abruptly, but sliding down slowly until his fingers rested lightly against her hand, and then, after a brief hesitation, he turned that same hand outward, toward his father, not fully reaching, not yet, but opening a space between them that had not existed before, and the gesture was small, fragile, but unmistakable, and it landed heavier than any words could have, because it was not forced, not directed, it was chosen. and Richard saw it, felt it, the quiet invitation, and for a second he did not move, not because he did not want to, but because he understood now that rushing would break it, that this moment belonged to Ethan, not to him, and so he waited, something he had rarely done in his life, his hand lifting slowly, carefully, stopping just short of contact, giving his son the chance to close the distance if he was ready, and the room, though still filled with people, seemed to fall away entirely, leaving only the three of them in a space defined not by power or expectation, but by something far more difficult to build and far more meaningful to hold, and in that suspended second, with light softening across the floor and the music barely reaching them, the truth settled into place, quiet but undeniable, that what had just happened could not be undone, and what came next would no longer follow the same rules. The space between them held, delicate and unbroken, Ethan's hand still hovering in that quiet offering, not reaching fully but no longer withdrawn, and Richard Whitmore understood in a way he had not before that this moment was not his to control, not his to command into place, it was something that had to be met with patience, something that required him to step into a role he had never practiced, and slowly, carefully, he lowered himself, not completely to the floor, but enough to reduce the distance, enough to meet his son at a level that did not tower over him, his movements measured, deliberate, as if any sudden shift might undo what had been built, and Ava watched the adjustment without interrupting, her presence still anchored, her breathing steady, allowing the space to widen just enough to include him without losing the calm that had settled, and Ethan noticed, his gaze lifting slightly, tracking the movement, not with fear this time, but with cautious awareness, and when Richard stopped, leaving a small, respectful distance between them, the room seemed to quiet even further, the faint music now nothing more than a distant echo, the soft clink of glass and murmur of voices fading into the background as something more important took its place, and for a long second, no one spoke, no one moved, the moment stretching into something fragile and real, and then Richard did something no one in that room expected, something even he had not planned, he lowered his voice, not to command, not to direct, but to meet. "It is okay," he said softly, the words unfamiliar in his mouth, not because they were difficult to say, but because he had never needed to say them this way before, and Ethan's fingers shifted slightly at the sound, his hand inching forward, closing just a fraction of the space that remained, not fully, not completely, but enough to signal something had changed, and Richard did not rush it, did not take the hand, he simply let his own rest nearby, open, steady, waiting, and Ava felt the shift settle fully now, the balance no longer fragile in the same way, but grounded, held between them without force, and for the first time since she had stepped forward, she allowed herself to move just slightly, not away, not breaking the connection, but easing her position enough to give them room, her hand still there, still present, but no longer the center, and Ethan responded, his fingers loosening from her sleeve, not pulling away in fear, but releasing in trust, his attention now divided, no longer locked in survival, but open enough to include both of them, and Richard saw it, felt it, the quiet permission in that shift, and his hand moved just a little closer, not touching yet, but close enough that the space between them felt smaller, manageable, real, and then Ethan did the rest, his hand moving forward that final inch, resting lightly against his father's, the contact brief, tentative, but undeniable, and Richard's breath caught, not visibly, not dramatically, but enough that something inside him shifted, something that had been rigid for far too long, and he did not close his hand around his son's, did not hold tightly. He simply let the contact exist, honoring it without overwhelming it, and around them, the room began to move again, quietly, carefully, as if aware that something important had happened without needing to name it, and Ava, still kneeling beside them, watched the moment settle into place, not as an ending, but as a beginning, something small but real, something that would not be erased by the return of music or conversation or expectation, because what had been built here, in silence and patience and understanding, had already changed the shape of everything that came after. The contact lingered only for a moment, light and careful, but it was enough to settle something that had been restless for far too long, and Ethan's hand slowly eased back, not in retreat, but in quiet completion, his shoulders relaxed, his breathing steady, his gaze no longer searching for escape but resting, present, grounded in a way that had not seemed possible just minutes earlier, and Richard Whitmore remained still, his hand lowering gently to his side, not pulling away sharply, not reclaiming control, but allowing the moment to close on its own terms, and in that small restraint, something unspoken took root, something that could not be forced or measured, only recognized, and Ava Johnson watched it happen without interruption, her posture calm, her presence softening as the tension fully dissolved, her role no longer central but still quietly essential, like the last note of a song that lingers even after the music fades. And around them the ballroom resumed its rhythm, the low hum of conversation returning, the clink of glasses and soft laughter filling the space once more. But it was different now, quieter in its energy, as if something invisible had shifted beneath the surface, something that those who witnessed it could not easily ignore. And Richard slowly rose to his full height, not with the sharp precision he had carried earlier, but with a measured ease, his gaze moving briefly across the room, acknowledging the eyes that had been watching, the expectations that still lingered, and for the first time that night, he did not seem concerned with them, not in the same way, because something else had taken precedence, something closer, something real, and when he looked back down at Ethan, there was a softness there, subtle but undeniable, the kind that did not announce itself but changed everything quietly, and Ethan, now calm, now steady, looked up at him. Without fear, without hesitation, simply present, and Richard held that gaze for a moment before shifting his attention to Ava, who had begun to rise slowly from the floor, her movements unhurried, her hand smoothing lightly against her uniform as she stepped back into the space she had once occupied, the space that kept her unseen. But this time it was different, because she was no longer invisible, not to him, not after what he had witnessed. And for a second, he seemed to search for words. Something to bridge the gap between authority and understanding, something to acknowledge what had just happened without diminishing it, but the words did not come easily, not for a man who had built his life on certainty, and so instead, he did something quieter, something far more meaningful in its restraint. He gave a small nod, not formal, not distant, but deliberate, an acknowledgement that carried more weight than any public statement could. And Ava met it with a simple, respectful incline of her head, no expectation, no demand, just recognition, and then she turned slightly, preparing to return to her duties, to step back into the rhythm of the evening as if nothing had changed, but everything had, and as she moved away, Ethan's eyes followed her for a brief moment, not with panic, not with fear, but with a quiet awareness, a memory forming, something that would remain long after the night ended, and Richard noticed it, the way his son tracked her presence, the way that connection lingered even without contact, and he did not call her back, did not interrupt her departure, because for the first time he understood that what mattered had already been given, not taken, not assigned, but offered freely, and as the chandelier